The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the apartment door while David Anderson was at his night shift at the warehouse. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in careful block letters across cream-colored paper. Inside, a single photograph, his 8-year-old son Ethan sitting at a school desk, unaware of the camera, unaware that someone had been watching. On the back, written in the same methodical hand, "Some debts never disappear. Happy early birthday, David." His birthday was still 3 days away. David's apartment in Sammamish represented everything he'd lost and everything he was fighting to rebuild. The one-bedroom unit above Anderson's Electronics, his grandfather's old shop, now shuttered, contained the remnants of a life that had unraveled 18 months ago. A fold-out couch that served as his bed. A small table where he ate instant meals and paid bills with money that never seemed enough. A corner dedicated to Ethan's visits, toys arranged with museum-like precision, waiting for weekends that came too rarely. The divorce had been swift and surgical. Jessica had documented everything: the gambling debts, the missed mortgage payments, the lies. She'd taken Ethan to her mother's house in Bellevue, 20 miles that might as well have been 3,000. David saw his son every other weekend, court-mandated visits that felt like borrowed time. But that had been before Ethan got sick. The leukemia diagnosis came 6 months after the divorce finalized. Jessica called him at 3 a.m., her voice hollow with exhaustion and terror. David had driven through the night to Seattle Children's Hospital, arriving to find his ex-wife curled in a hospital chair beside their son's bed. Ethan looked impossibly small connected to machines that beeped and hummed their mechanical lullabies. The insurance covered most treatments, but not all. Not the experimental therapy that offered better odds. Not the private room that would spare Ethan from seeing other children die. Not the medications that might preserve his future fertility, his cognitive function, his chance at anything resembling a normal life. David sold everything. The motorcycle he'd restored in the garage. His father's watch collection. His grandmother's wedding ring. He took second mortgages and third jobs. He borrowed from friends until he had no friends left to ask. When legitimate sources dried up, he found other options, men who met in parking lots and spoke in cash amounts that made his stomach clench. Ethan went into remission after 8 months. The doctors called it miraculous. Jessica cried for the first time since the diagnosis. David celebrated by taking another loan from Marcus Rodriguez, whose patience was wearing thin. Now, 3 months later, Ethan was healthy and thriving, and David owed $47,000 to people who didn't send payment reminder notices. The photograph on his table seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Someone knew where Ethan went to school. Someone was watching. Someone was counting down to his birthday. David's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Ethan's asking about your birthday. Can he call tonight?" He stared at the message, then at the photograph. His reflection in the apartment window showed a man who'd aged decades in 2 years, hollow cheeks, gray threading through brown hair, eyes that had learned to see danger in shadows. He texted back, "Tell him I'm working late. Maybe tomorrow." The lie came easily now. Everything was a lie when the truth might put your child in danger. The electronics shop below David's apartment had been closed for 6 months, but someone was moving around inside. David pressed his ear to the floor, listening to footsteps that seemed purposeful, methodical. The sounds came at different times, sometimes during his morning shift at the warehouse, sometimes late at night when he returned from his evening job delivering pizzas. Mrs. Thompson from across the street mentioned seeing lights in the shop windows. She was 73 and prone to conspiracy theories about the neighborhood changing, but her observations were usually accurate. Someone had been using his grandfather's old shop as if they owned it. David found the first set of broken locks when he went to check the building's foundation after a heavy rain. The front door to the shop looked secure from the street, but the deadbolt had been picked and reset. The back entrance showed similar signs of expert entry, scratches around the lock mechanism that suggested professional tools. Inside, the shop looked exactly as he'd left it. Dusty shelves lined with old television sets and radio parts. His grandfather's workbench covered with the kind of electronic components that had been obsolete for 20 years. But something felt different. The dust patterns had been disturbed. Items had been moved and carefully replaced. In the back office, he found evidence that someone had been using the space regularly. A coffee cup in the trash, still stained but dry. Electrical outlets that showed recent use. Most disturbing, a clear view through the office window to the stairway leading to his apartment. David installed new locks and a security camera disguised as a smoke detector. The first night's recording showed a figure in dark clothing entering through the back door at 2 a.m. The person moved with familiarity through the shop, spending most of their time in the office, apparently watching the camera feed on a laptop computer. The figure's face remained hidden beneath a baseball cap, but their build and movements suggested someone younger, more agile than Marcus Rodriguez or his usual collection agents. This felt personal in a way that transcended money. David began varying his routines. Different routes to work, different times for errands, different patterns of light usage in his apartment. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Shadows seemed to move when they shouldn't. Cars followed him for one block too many. His phone would ring once and disconnect, always at 3:17 a.m., always from blocked numbers. 3 days before his birthday, Ethan called while Jessica was at the grocery store. "Dad, there's a lady at my school who says she knows you." David's blood chilled. "What lady, buddy?" "She helps in the office sometimes. She said you used to fix her TV when she was little. She remembers your grandfather's shop." "What did she look like?" "I don't know. Brown hair?" "She seemed nice." "She asked about your birthday." David forced his voice to remain calm. "Ethan, if anyone asks about me or talks to you about our family, you need to tell Mom right away, okay?" "Why? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. It's important to be careful about strangers." But she wasn't a stranger. "She works at school." After Ethan hung up, David called the elementary school. The secretary confirmed they had several volunteer helpers, but couldn't provide details about staff without proper authorization. When David pressed, mentioning his concern about someone approaching his son, her tone became guarded. "Sir, if you have specific concerns about your child's safety, you need to speak with the principal. But I should mention that we've had some questions about your financial situation. There may be some confusion about emergency contacts." David felt the ground shifting beneath him. Someone was asking questions about him at his son's school. Someone was creating confusion about his relationship with Ethan. Someone was systematically dismantling the careful boundaries he'd constructed to keep his problems separate from his son's life. That night, the camera in the shop captured something new. The figure wasn't alone. 2 people moved through the space, one pointing at the apartment stairs while the other took photographs with a professional-looking camera. They spent an hour examining his building's security, testing locks, measuring windows. David packed a bag and drove to a motel near the warehouse. He called in sick to both jobs and spent the day researching private investigator services he couldn't afford. By evening, he convinced himself he was overreacting. The stress of his debts was making him paranoid. Marcus Rodriguez wanted money, not elaborate psychological warfare. He returned to his apartment as the sun set. The lock on his door had been changed. Inside his apartment, everything looked normal except for small, deliberate changes that made David's skin crawl. His coffee mug had been moved 2 inches to the left. The bills on his table were arranged in a different order. A book he'd been reading was open to a different page with a sentence highlighted in yellow. "The past never stays buried when there's money involved." On his pillow lay a manila envelope containing photocopies of documents he'd never seen before. Financial records showing payments to offshore accounts. Medical bills with his forged signature. Insurance forms claiming Ethan had pre-existing conditions that should have voided coverage. Someone had been building a file on him, documenting not just his debts but creating evidence of fraud. The paperwork was thorough, professional, and completely damning. If these documents reached the right authorities, David would face federal charges. If they reached Jessica's attorney, he would lose what little custody he still had. Attached to the papers was a note. "You borrowed more than money, David. Tomorrow we discuss the interest." David spent the night in his car, parked across from the elementary school. He watched Ethan's classroom windows until the building filled with staff and students. Only when he saw his son safely inside did he allow himself to consider his options. Marcus Rodriguez operated from a restaurant in downtown Seattle. David had never been invited to the back office, but he knew the location. Their previous meetings had taken place in parking lots or bars, always brief, always focused on payment schedules and consequences for delays. The restaurant appeared closed despite the early afternoon hour. David knocked on the front door until a teenage boy opened it and pointed him toward the back without speaking. Marcus Rodriguez looked like someone's grandfather, gray hair, kind eyes, cardigan sweater. He was reading a newspaper and eating soup when David entered the office. "You're early," Marcus said without looking up. "Your payment isn't due until Friday. Someone's been watching my son. Watching me. Breaking into my apartment. I need to know if this is connected to what I owe you." Marcus folded his newspaper carefully. "David, I've known your family for 30 years. Your grandfather was a good man who paid his debts on time. Your father was less reliable, but he honored his commitments eventually. I don't involve children in business matters." "Then who?" "That depends on what other business you've been conducting." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean that $47,000 doesn't qualify you for the kind of attention you're describing. That level of surveillance, the psychological pressure, that suggests someone with different motivations or different resources." Marcus opened a desk drawer and withdrew a folder. Inside were photographs of David's apartment building, his workplace, his ex-wife's house. Professional surveillance photos taken with high-end equipment. "These were delivered to me yesterday," Marcus said. "Someone wants me to know they're watching you. Someone wants me to know they have information that could make your debts irrelevant compared to your other problems." David studied the photographs. They showed details of his life that even Marcus shouldn't know. His work schedules, Jessica's grocery shopping routine, Ethan's after-school activities. Who took these? That's what I'd like to know. Because whoever it is has resources that suggest either law enforcement or someone with significant money. Neither option is good for my business. Marcus closed the folder. "David, I'm going to give you some advice. Whatever you did to attract this level of attention, fix it quickly. Because if someone is willing to invest this much time and money in watching you, they want something worth more than what you owe me." David left the restaurant with more questions than answers. Marcus Rodriguez, despite his profession, had always been straightforward in their dealings. His concerns seemed genuine, which made David's situation infinitely more terrifying. On the drive back to Sammamish, David tried to inventory his life for other sources of danger. The gambling debts that had destroyed his marriage were old news, settled through the divorce. His current financial problems were recent and directly related to Ethan's medical expenses. He had no criminal history, no hidden assets, no secrets worth $47,000 in surveillance costs. Unless someone thought he did. David parked outside the public library and used their computers to search for information about himself online. Most results related to his grandfather's electronics shop or high school sports achievements from 20 years ago. But buried on the fourth page of results was something new, a business registration filing for Anderson Recovery Services, listing David as the primary contact. The registration was dated 6 months ago. David had never heard of Anderson Recovery Services. According to the filing, the business specialized in asset recovery and debt resolution, with an address matching his grandfather's old shop. Someone had created a fictitious business using his identity. Someone wanted him to appear involved in activities that could explain large sums of money. Someone was constructing a narrative that would make him look guilty of crimes he'd never committed. David's phone rang as he stared at the computer screen. Unknown number. "Hello, David. Happy birthday." It was tomorrow. His birthday was tomorrow. Who is this? Someone who knew your grandfather very well. Someone who remembers when you were Ethan's age, playing in that electronics shop while old Anderson fixed radios for half the neighborhood. The voice was female, cultured, with an accent he couldn't place. familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. He was a good man, your grandfather. Honest. He understood that some debts transcend money. What do you want? I want you to come home, David. Tomorrow night. 8 o'clock. Come alone, and we'll discuss the birthday present I have for you. The line went dead. David sat in the library parking lot as darkness fell around him. Tomorrow was his 40th birthday. Tomorrow, someone who remembered him as a child wanted to meet in his grandfather's old shop. Tomorrow, whatever game was being played would reach its conclusion. He thought about calling Jessica, warning her to keep Ethan away from school. But what could he say that wouldn't sound like the paranoid ramblings of a man whose life had spiraled beyond control? Instead, he drove to the nearest hardware store and bought everything he could afford for home security. Motion sensors, additional locks, pepper spray, a baseball bat. The cashier looked at him with the knowing expression of someone who'd seen domestic violence preparations before. That night, David didn't sleep. He sat by his window, watching the street, listening for footsteps in the shop below. At 3:17 a.m., his phone rang once and disconnected. At 4:15 a.m., a car drove slowly past his building, pausing long enough for someone to take photographs. By dawn, David had made his decision. He would go to the meeting. He would face whatever debt his family owed. But first, he would make sure Ethan was safe. David's birthday dawned gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look dingy and threatening. He called in sick to both jobs, then drove to Bellevue to see Ethan one last time before the evening's confrontation. Jessica answered the door with suspicion immediately visible on her face. She looked tired, older than her 36 years, worn down by the constant stress of single parenthood and lingering fear about Ethan's health. You can't just show up here, David. We have a schedule. I know. I wanted to see him. It's my birthday. Jessica's expression softened slightly. Despite everything between them, she wasn't cruel. He made you something at school. A card. Ethan appeared in the hallway, grinning with the unconscious joy of a child who hadn't yet learned that birthdays could be complicated. He thrust a construction paper card toward David, decorated with crayon drawings of electronics and tools. I drew Grandpa Anderson's workshop. Mom showed me pictures. The card's front showed a child's interpretation of the old shop, television sets with rabbit ears, a workbench covered with mysterious components, and two stick figures labeled Grandpa and Daddy. Inside, Ethan had written in careful 8-year-old handwriting, "Happy birthday, Dad. I love you more than all the electrons in the universe." David felt tears threaten and forced them back. "It's perfect, buddy. Thank you." They spent an hour together in Jessica's living room, playing board games and pretending everything was normal. Ethan chattered about school, his friends, his plans for summer vacation. Jessica watched from the kitchen, occasionally joining the conversation, but mostly maintaining careful distance. When it came time to leave, Ethan hugged David with the fierce intensity of a child who sensed something wrong but couldn't articulate what. "Will I see you next weekend, Dad?" "I hope so, buddy. I really hope so." David drove back to Sammamish with Ethan's card on the passenger seat. Whatever happened tonight, his son would remember this afternoon. Whatever debt needed to be paid, it wouldn't touch Ethan's memories of his father's love. At 6 o'clock, David positioned himself across the street from the electronics shop. He wanted to observe whoever arrived, to understand what he was walking into. The shop looked abandoned and innocent in the early evening light, just another failed business in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. At 7:30, a black sedan pulled up to the building's rear entrance. Two figures got out, one tall and lean, moving with military precision, the other shorter and more deliberate. They entered through the back door using keys, which meant they'd had the locks changed to match their access needs. At 7:50, David crossed the street and walked to the front entrance. The door was unlocked. A small sign had been placed in the window, "Anderson Recovery Services, by appointment only." Inside, the shop had been transformed. The dusty electronics were gone, replaced by modern furniture and professional lighting. His grandfather's workbench had been cleared and polished, turned into a conference table. File cabinets lined one wall, suggesting permanent occupation. The woman sitting at the table was approximately 50 years old, with silver hair and sharp features that suggested intelligence and ruthlessness in equal measure. She wore an expensive suit and the kind of jewelry that indicated serious money. David had never seen her before, but something about her presence felt familiar. The tall man stood near the door, clearly security rather than negotiation. His jacket was cut to accommodate concealed weapons, and his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging exits and potential threats. David Anderson. Please sit down. We have much to discuss. David remained standing. Who are you? My name is Catherine Williamson. I was your grandfather's business partner for many years. I've been waiting a long time to meet with you. My grandfather never had business partners. He ran a repair shop. Catherine smiled, and the expression was both patient and predatory. Your grandfather, may he rest in peace, was involved in many enterprises. The repair shop was, shall we call it a front operation? She opened a file folder and withdrew several photographs. They showed David's grandfather as a younger man, dressed in expensive clothes, shaking hands with people who looked like they belonged in government or organized crime. The photos were old, probably from the 1970s and 80s, but they suggested a life David had never known existed. Anderson Electronics was indeed a repair shop, but it was also a money laundering operation, a safe house for various activities, and a distribution point for information that certain parties preferred to keep quiet. Your grandfather was quite successful at all of these endeavors. David stared at the photographs. His grandfather had been a quiet man who spoke little English and seemed to care only about his family and his work. The idea of him involved in criminal enterprises felt impossible. I don't believe you. Belief is irrelevant. Documentation is what matters. Catherine withdrew another set of papers. Bank records showing large deposits to accounts in his grandfather's name. Property deeds revealing ownership of several buildings beyond the shop. Insurance policies worth millions of dollars. When your grandfather died, he left significant assets that were never properly distributed. Assets that, according to our partnership agreements, should have come to me. David felt the ground shifting again. What does this have to do with me? You inherited more than a building, David. You inherited debts and obligations that your grandfather never fulfilled. My patience with this family has been extensive, but patience has limits. The tall man moved closer, and David caught a glimpse of the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. How much? David asked. The principal amount, with 20 years of compounded interest, comes to approximately $2.3 million. The number hit David like a physical blow. $2.3 million. More money than he would earn in 10 lifetimes. Money that existed in a universe completely separate from his reality of warehouse shifts and pizza deliveries. I don't have that kind of money. I don't have any money. I'm aware of your financial situation. I'm also aware of your recent borrowing activities, your son's medical expenses, and your willingness to sacrifice everything for family loyalty. These are admirable qualities that your grandfather would have appreciated. Catherine closed the file folder. I'm prepared to offer you an alternative to monetary payment. What kind of alternative? The shop will be returning to its original purposes. I need someone to manage the day-to-day operations. Someone with the Anderson family name and reputation. Someone who understands the importance of discretion. David felt the trap closing around him. You want me to run a criminal enterprise? I want you to honor your family's commitments. The work isn't dangerous if conducted properly. The profits are substantial. Within 5 years, you could pay off all your debts and establish significant savings for Ethan's future. And if I refuse? Catherine's smile became colder. Then we pursue other collection methods. Your debt to Marcus Rodriguez would become public record. The fraudulent insurance claims related to Ethan's treatment would be investigated. Your ex-wife would receive documentation of your criminal activities. Your son would lose his father to federal prison. David understood now. The surveillance, the psychological pressure, the false business registration, All of it had been designed to force him into this moment. Catherine Williamson hadn't just been collecting on an old debt. She'd been constructing a scenario where his only choice was compliance. I need time to think. Time is a luxury you don't possess. I need an answer tonight. The tall man's hand moved toward his jacket. Outside, David could hear the sedan's engine running. Everything about this situation screamed professional operation, the kind of people who made problems disappear permanently. David thought about Ethan's card in his car, about Jessica's exhausted face, about the $47,000 he owed Marcus Rodriguez, the medical bills still arriving monthly, the custody schedule that gave him so little time with his son. Then he thought about his grandfather's hands, stained with solder and electronic components, always gentle when showing a young David how circuits worked. Whatever crimes his grandfather might have committed, he'd been a good man who loved his family. He built something in this shop, something that had sustained 3 generations. But he'd also apparently built something darker. What exactly would I be managing? Catherine's smile became genuine for the first time that evening. I knew you were a practical man, David. Just like your grandfather. The conversation continued for another hour, with Catherine outlining the specifics of what she called the family business. The shop would serve as a coordination center for various enterprises, money laundering, document services, secure communications. David's role would be largely administrative, managing schedules and maintaining the legitimate repair business that would serve as cover. The work itself didn't sound immediately dangerous, but David understood he was being recruited into something that would eventually demand more than administrative duties. Catherine Williamson hadn't waited 20 years and invested in elaborate surveillance to acquire a bookkeeper. There's one more thing, Catherine said as the meeting appeared to be concluding. A demonstration of trust between us. She withdrew a cell phone and dialed a number. After a brief conversation, she handed the phone to David. Daddy? Ethan's voice sinised through David's veins. His son sounded confused and frightened. Ethan, where are you? Are you okay? I'm with the nice lady from school. She said you asked her to pick me up. But Mom wasn't home, and I'm scared. David looked at Catherine, who watched his reaction with professional interest. The tall man had moved to block the door. The demonstration, Catherine explained calmly, is whether you can make decisions quickly when your son's safety depends on it. David felt rage building in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm for Ethan's sake. Let me talk to the woman who has him. Catherine took the phone back and spoke briefly before returning it to David. Hello, David. The voice was different from the one that had called him at the library, younger, with a slight southern accent. Your boy is safe and unharmed. He thinks this is all a misunderstanding that will be resolved quickly. Where are you? That depends on your conversation with Ms. Williamson. Ethan is comfortable and believes he'll be going home soon. Whether that happens depends on you. Catherine gestured for the phone's return. This isn't meant as a threat, David. It's meant as clarity. Your family's safety has always been contingent on honoring family obligations. Your grandfather understood this. Your father never learned it, which is why his life ended so unfortunately early. David felt another piece of his reality crumble. His father had died in a car accident when David was 16. A rainy night, a curve taken too fast, a single-vehicle collision that the police had attributed to poor visibility and bad luck. My father's death was an accident. Your father tried to break family agreements. He believed he could walk away from obligations and start over somewhere else. That kind of thinking creates problems for everyone involved. Catherine opened another file folder. This one contained police reports, insurance documents, and photographs from an accident scene that David remembered with painful clarity. But it also contained other materials, maintenance records showing recently cut brake lines, witness statements that had never been included in official reports, and a coroner's findings that suggested his father had been unconscious before the collision. Now you understand the full scope of family loyalty, Catherine said. Your grandfather honored his commitments, and his death was natural and peaceful. Your father attempted to abandon his responsibilities, and the consequences were swift. Your choice will determine which path your own story follows. David stared at the photographs of his father's accident scene. The car wrapped around a tree, the scattered glass and metal, the investigation that had concluded within 24 hours. His father had been driving to a job interview in Portland, pursuing opportunities that would have taken the family away from Washington, away from the shop, away from obligations David was only now beginning to understand. The phone rang again. Ethan's voice was higher now, more frightened. "Daddy, when are you coming to get me? The lady says we're going on a trip, but I don't want to go anywhere. I want to go home." David felt something fundamental break inside him. 20 years of careful living, of following rules and meeting obligations, of trying to be the kind of father and husband who created safety for the people he loved. None of it had mattered. The past had been waiting all along, patient and inexorable, ready to claim another generation. Put me back on with the woman. "Hello, David. If you hurt him, I'll spend the rest of my life hunting you down. Do you understand me? I understand that you're a father who loves his son. That's exactly why this arrangement will work successfully." Catherine gestured for the phone's return. "David, you have 5 minutes to decide. Your son can be home within the hour, or he can become part of an extended conversation about family loyalty. The choice is entirely yours." David looked around the shop that had been his childhood sanctuary. The walls where his grandfather had taught him about electronics and patience. The workbench where he learned that most problems had solutions if you understood the underlying circuits. The office where he'd done homework while his grandfather worked late into the evening. Everything had been a lie, or everything had been more complicated than a child could understand. "I need guarantees about Ethan's safety. You have my word that your family will be protected as long as family obligations are met. I need more than your word." Catherine considered this for a moment, then nodded to the tall man, who withdrew something from his jacket. Not a weapon, but a document that looked like a legal contract. "This outlines the terms of our arrangement, including specific protections for your family members. Your ex-wife and son will be provided with security monitoring and emergency response services. Any threats to their safety will be treated as threats to our business interests." David read through the contract quickly. It was professionally prepared, with language that made their criminal enterprise sound like a legitimate consulting agreement. But buried in the legal terminology were specific clauses about family protection, education funding for Ethan, and medical coverage that would eliminate the debts that had started this entire nightmare. The document also outlined penalties for breach of contract. The language was euphemistic, but the meaning was clear. "If I sign this, there's no way out." There was never a way out, David. There was only the question of whether you would acknowledge reality quickly enough to protect the people you love. David's phone rang one more time. Ethan was crying now. "Daddy, please come get me. I don't like this game anymore." David signed the contract. Ethan was returned within an hour, delivered to Jessica's house with a story about miscommunication regarding pickup schedules. The woman who brought him was apologetic and professional, explaining that there had been confusion about emergency contacts at the school. Jessica was annoyed but not suspicious. The explanation fit the pattern of bureaucratic mistakes that seemed to plague single-parent logistics. David received a text message with a photograph of Ethan safe in his mother's arms, followed by an address where he should report for work the following Monday. The weekend passed in a haze of surreal normalcy. David cleaned his apartment, paid what bills he could afford, and tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. His entire life had been restructured in the course of a single evening, and yet nothing visible had changed. He still lived in the same apartment, still owed money to Marcus Rodriguez, still saw his son on alternate weekends. But everything was different. On Monday morning, David arrived at the electronics shop to find it transformed yet again. The professional furniture was gone, replaced by displays of vintage electronics and repair equipment that looked remarkably similar to what his grandfather had maintained. A young woman named Ashley sat at the front counter, explaining to an elderly customer how much it would cost to repair a 1970s television set. Catherine Williamson was nowhere to be seen. Ashley introduced herself as the day manager and explained David's duties with the casual efficiency of someone who'd conducted similar orientations before. The shop would operate as a legitimate electronics repair business, handling vintage equipment and specialty projects that required custom solutions. Most of the work was straightforward and profitable. The other activities would be managed through the back office, with specific schedules and protocols that David would learn gradually. For now, his job was to establish expertise with the repair business and build relationships with the kinds of customers who appreciated discretion. Within 6 months, David's financial situation had stabilized completely. The repair business generated legitimate income, while the back-office activities provided what Catherine euphemistically called performance bonuses. David paid off his debt to Marcus Rodriguez and established savings accounts for Ethan's future education. His credit score improved. His stress levels decreased. His relationship with Jessica became cordial as financial pressure disappeared. Ethan thrived. His health remained stable, his school performance improved, and his weekend visits with David became more relaxed as his father's anxiety diminished. They spent hours in the repair shop, with Ethan learning the same electronic skills that David had acquired at his age. The boy showed natural aptitude for understanding circuits and problem-solving, carrying on what appeared to be a family tradition. But David never forgot the truth underlying his improved circumstances. The protection his family enjoyed was conditional. The stability he'd achieved was contingent on continued cooperation with enterprises he didn't fully understand. The people who'd orchestrated his recruitment remained largely invisible, but their influence touched every aspect of his reconstructed life. Late at night, when the shop was closed and the legitimate customers were gone, different people arrived for different services. David learned to ask no questions and remember no details. He processed transactions, managed schedules, and maintained equipment without curiosity about the larger operations he was supporting. Sometimes Catherine Williamson appeared for brief conversations about business development or procedural adjustments. She was invariably professional and courteous, treating David as a valued colleague rather than a coerced participant. But he never forgot the casual way she'd orchestrated Ethan's kidnapping to ensure his compliance. The arrangement worked efficiently for everyone involved. David had job security, family protection, and financial stability. Catherine had a trusted manager with strong motivation to maintain operational security. Ethan had a father who could afford to provide opportunities and experiences that had seemed impossible just months before. On David's 41st birthday, Ethan presented him with another homemade card. This one showed the electronics shop in more sophisticated detail, with accurate representations of the equipment and careful attention to the tools David used daily. Inside, Ethan had written, "Thank you for teaching me about circuits, Dad. I want to work with you when I grow up." David studied the card for a long time, thinking about legacy and obligation, about the choices that created safety and the compromises that ensured survival. His grandfather had made similar choices decades ago, building something that sustained his family while binding them to consequences that persisted across generations. Now it was David's turn to carry that weight, to honor obligations he'd never chosen while protecting people he loved more than his own life. Ethan would inherit the shop eventually, along with whatever debts and responsibilities came with the family name. But he would also inherit the skills and resources necessary to navigate that inheritance successfully. The circle was complete, as it had always been intended to be. If you were David Anderson, what would you have done differently? At what point would you have made different choices? The truth is, most of us believe we would resist, fight back, find another way. We tell ourselves that we would never compromise our values, never accept criminal involvement, never allow our children to be threatened without consequences. We believe in our own moral clarity right up until the moment when abstract principles collide with concrete dangers to the people we love most. David's story isn't unique. Across the country, families are bound by obligations they never chose and debts they never incurred. Children inherit more than money and property. They inherit the consequences of decisions made by previous generations. The past never stays buried when there's money involved, or power, or secrets worth protecting. The most disturbing element of David's situation isn't the criminal enterprise or the psychological manipulation. It's the efficiency with which the system worked. His recruitment was professionally planned and flawlessly executed. His compliance was ensured through leverage that made resistance impossible. His integration into the organization was seamless and profitable for everyone involved. This efficiency suggests practice. It suggests a model that has been refined through repetition. It suggests that David's grandfather wasn't the first generation to face these choices, and Ethan won't be the last. How many Anderson families exist across the Pacific Northwest? How many repair shops and legitimate businesses serve as fronts for activities that bind entire bloodlines to obligations they can never escape? How many parents make compromises they swore they'd never make, justifying each surrender as protection for children who will eventually face the same impossible choices? The answers to these questions exist in plain sight, hidden behind the facade of normal communities and ordinary businesses. They exist in the space between what we believe about family loyalty and what we're willing to do to honor it. They exist in the gap between the stories we tell ourselves about our values and the reality of what we'll sacrifice to protect the people we love. David Anderson believed he was saving his son. Catherine Williamson believed she was collecting a legitimate debt. Ethan believes his father is a skilled electronics repair specialist who loves him unconditionally. Jessica believes her ex-husband finally got his life together through hard work and determination. Everyone's story is true from their perspective. Everyone's choices make sense within their understanding of the situation. The most effective forms of control don't feel like control at all. They feel like the only rational response to circumstances beyond our influence. But here's what David learned too late. The circumstances weren't beyond anyone's influence. They were carefully constructed by people who understood that parents will sacrifice anything, including their own moral boundaries, to ensure their children's safety and future success. The gradual breakdown of David's reality wasn't accidental. It was engineered by professionals who knew exactly how much pressure to apply, and when, and through which channels. They understood that a man who'd already lost everything to save his son would lose even more when presented with evidence that everything wasn't enough. The birthday visitor wasn't a stranger at all. Catherine Williamson had been watching the Anderson family for decades, waiting for the right moment to collect on obligations that spanned generations. She'd monitored David's marriage, his financial struggles, his son's illness, and his increasing desperation. She'd waited until he was isolated, vulnerable, and emotionally exhausted before making her move. The most chilling aspect of this story isn't what happened to David. It's how inevitable it was from the moment his grandfather made his first compromise decades ago. Each generation believed they were making temporary sacrifices to protect the next generation, never understanding that they were actually binding their children to the same impossible choices. Ethan Anderson is 8 years old now. He loves working in his father's electronics shop. He shows natural aptitude for understanding circuits and problem-solving. He trusts his father completely and believes in the safety of their reconstructed life. In 10 years, when Ethan turns 18, what obligations will he inherit along with the shop? What debts will be transferred to his name? What choices will he face when Catherine Williamson, or her successors, decide it's time for the next generation to honor family commitments? David tells himself that he'll find a way to break the cycle before then. He tells himself that he's buying time to develop an exit strategy, that his compliance is temporary, that he can protect Ethan from inheriting this burden. But Catherine Williamson has heard these promises before, from David's grandfather and father. She knows that parents always believe they can sacrifice themselves to save their children, never understanding that the sacrifice itself ensures their children will face the same choices. The cycle continues because it's designed to continue. Because people like Catherine Williamson understand that family love is the most reliable form of leverage ever developed. Because parents will always choose their children's immediate safety over abstract future consequences. Because each generation believes they're strong enough to bear burdens that their children won't have to carry. David's story ends where it began, with a father trying to protect his son, making choices that feel necessary and heroic, creating obligations that will bind the next generation to consequences he can't imagine. The birthday visitor brought more than threats and demands. She brought the weight of history, the inevitability of inheritance, and the terrible logic of family loyalty. Ethan's birthday is still years away, but somewhere, someone is already planning what gift they'll bring when he comes of age. Across communities throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond, families are bound by obligations they never chose, trapped in cycles of compromise that span generations. Children inherit more than assets. They inherit the consequences of survival strategies their parents never intended to pass down. If you recognize elements of David's situation in your own life or community, understand that isolation is part of the trap. The belief that you're alone, that your circumstances are unique, that no one would understand your choices, these beliefs serve the interests of people who profit from your silence. Resources exist. Legal aid organizations in Washington state specialize in family protection. The FBI's Seattle field office has dedicated units for organized crime and family exploitation. Witness protection programs provide genuine safety for people trapped in criminal enterprises. Financial counseling services through King County can identify alternatives to predatory lending. Child Protective Services can create safety plans that don't require parental compliance with criminal organizations. But these resources only work when people reach out before the trap closes completely. David's mistake wasn't loving his son. It was believing that love required him to bear his burdens alone. By the time he understood the true scope of what he was facing, his options had been systematically eliminated. If you're facing impossible choices between family safety and legal compliance, if you're being pressured to participate in activities that compromise your values, if you're carrying obligations inherited from previous generations, speak to someone before the pressure becomes unbearable. The temporary discomfort of seeking help is infinitely preferable to the permanent consequences of allowing yourself to be isolated and manipulated. Most importantly, understand that the people who create these situations are professionals. They have experience, resources, and patience that individuals and families don't possess. They count on your love for your family, your pride in handling your own problems, and your fear of judgment from others. They win when you believe you have no choice but to comply. You always have choices. They may not be good choices, but they exist. The key is accessing them before you're too isolated, too compromised, or too frightened to recognize alternatives. David Anderson's story doesn't have to be your story. Ethan Anderson's future doesn't have to mirror his grandfather's past. But breaking these cycles requires recognizing them before they're complete, and reaching for help before the help becomes impossible to accept. The birthday visitor only has power if you answer the door alone. If you suspect that businesses in your community serve as fronts for illegal activities, if you notice families whose financial situations improve dramatically without clear explanation, if children in your neighborhood mention adults who ask unusual questions about their families, these observations matter. Local law enforcement depends on community awareness to identify and disrupt criminal enterprises that exploit family relationships. Breaking cycles of family-based criminal exploitation requires community involvement. It requires neighbors who notice, teachers who ask questions, friends who offer alternatives to isolation. It requires all of us to understand that family loyalty becomes a weapon when it's manipulated by professionals who understand its power. David Anderson answered his door alone. Ethan Anderson doesn't have to.